Why did she move without hesitation when everyone else froze? That question lingered in the minds of every witness on that sun-baked Arizona highway. One second a child lay sprawled on the asphalt, eyes wide with terror. The next, a woman was in motion, her body a blur against the impossible weight of a jackknifing 18-wheeler. She dove, not for her own survival but for his. Time fractured in that moment. The air tasted of burning rubber and scorched metal. Tires screamed, brakes failed, and the world seemed to fold in on itself. She wrapped her arms around the boy, pulling him into her chest. Her cheek pressed against the crown of his head, the smell of crayons and dust in his hair, the faint weight of innocence against her ribs. For a fraction of a heartbeat she wondered if this was the end. Then the underbelly of the truck roared above them, steel and thunder, a shadow of annihilation, and somehow they rolled free. Alive. Rebecca Miller's lungs burned as she drew her first breath after the dive. The boy, Tyler, whimpered, but he was whole. She tightened her hold until her body ached, her forearms scraped raw from asphalt, her shoulders screaming from the roll, but she had him. He was breathing. That was all that mattered. A tall man was suddenly there, dropping to his knees beside them. Weathered skin, eyes sharp like a hawk's, the kind of eyes that had measured distances under fire. "Ma'am," he said firmly, low and steady, as if he'd spoken in combat zones more than kitchens. "Open your eyes, can you move?" Her eyes snapped open, bright, alert, focused not on herself but on the child she still shielded. "The boy," she gasped. "Check the boy first." He obeyed. There was authority in her voice, the kind that didn't beg, it ordered. His hands were steady as he looked Tyler over. The boy wiggled his toes. No spinal injury. A miracle. The man, Jack Harrison, though she didn't yet know his name, nodded with respect. The crowd gathered, phones raised, their curiosity louder than their concern. Rebecca hated it. The child was trembling, his mother's cry cutting through the noise as she reached them. Relief. Fear. The agony of a parent who nearly lost everything in the time it takes to drop a toy. Rebecca tried to rise but winced, her shoulder flaming. The man offered her his hand. She took it and he pulled her up with quiet strength. His eyes scanned her. "That was either the bravest or the craziest damn thing I've seen." Her lips curved into the smallest smile. "My father was Navy, raised me to act. I'm a trauma nurse at County General." That explained the composure. That explained why, when instinct should have screamed run, hers had whispered move, protect, shield. But she didn't tell him the rest. Not yet. Not how every decision she made carried the echo of her father's sacrifice. Commander James Miller had saved a recon team in the Gulf, but he never came home. She, grown up in the shadow of his medals, his folded flag, his absence. She, grown up learning that sometimes heroes weren't remembered, they were buried. The boy's mother clutched him, sobbing thanks into Rebecca's shoulder. Rebecca could only nod. Words felt too heavy. She had done what anyone should, but she knew not everyone would. The tall man knew it too. His gaze said so. Sirens broke the moment. Police cruisers, an ambulance, authority descending on chaos, and with it tension. The boy's mother, Karen, was trembling, torn between gratitude and anger, between relief and dread. She recognized Jack Harrison, recognized the steel brotherhood patch on his vest. Old pain flared in her eyes. Rebecca felt it, though she didn't yet understand. She only knew this family carried history, and history had teeth. At the station, questions sharpened into accusations. Protocol wrapped around compassion like barbed wire. They wanted statements, responsibility, blame. Rebecca stood her ground, her voice steady but firm. This was no negligence. No one could have predicted it. The boy's alive because we moved. That's the truth. Still, truth wasn't enough. Politics had seeped into the cracks. Power wanted a scapegoat. The new prosecutor wanted headlines. And Karen, grieving widow, protective mother, was an easy target. Rebecca sat beside her in that harsh fluorescent light. She could feel the woman's exhaustion, the way she clung to her boy like he was oxygen. Rebecca placed a hand over hers, gentle, grounding. "You're not alone. Not anymore. The words surprised even her. She hadn't meant to say them, but she meant them. Jack watched from across the room, arms folded, reading every flicker in Rebecca's face. He saw something there. Not just courage, not just instinct, but history, the kind of weight that didn't show on skin but lived deep in the bones. And outside, the rumble began. Low at first, then louder. Motorcycles, dozens of them, converging on the horizon. A brotherhood summoned not by vanity, but by oath. They came for Steve Thompson's son, for the boy whose father had saved lives on this very stretch of highway 5 years before. They came because promises didn't die with the man who made them. Rebecca stood at the station window, hearing the engines roll across the desert like a storm. She should have been afraid, but instead her chest tightened with something unfamiliar. Hope. Not because of the bikers, not even because of Jack, but because maybe, just maybe, the boy she had cradled against death wouldn't grow up as she had, alone with only a folded flag to explain his father. She didn't say it out loud. She didn't have to. The engines thundered closer, and the glass seemed to vibrate beneath her fingertips. She whispered to herself, soft enough no one else could hear. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And in that silence, she knew the fight had only just begun. What made her run toward danger when everyone else stepped back? The question lingered as Rebecca sat in the back of Jack Harrison's Harley, the desert wind tearing at her hair, the roar of the engine vibrating through her bones. She had never ridden a motorcycle before, yet here she was, clinging to a man she barely knew, headed toward a police station where the truth already felt like it was being rewritten. The boy's small body had been warm against her just minutes ago. She could still feel the weight of him, the fragile rise and fall of his chest as she shielded him beneath that truck. But now, away from the immediacy of danger, her thoughts caught up with her. Her father's voice, memory, not reality, echoed through her mind. You don't wait for someone else to move. When it counts, you step forward. She had stepped forward, but the cost of stepping forward was never simple. The police station loomed ahead, harsh and bureaucratic. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed with the same sterile indifference Rebecca had seen in too many ER waiting rooms. She hated the sound. It reminded her of loss, of waiting for news that never came. Corinne sat in the corner with Tyler clutched tight, her eyes sharp with suspicion whenever they drifted toward Jack. Rebecca felt it, the rift of old wounds between this woman and the Steel Brotherhood. She didn't yet know the history, but she could feel the tension like a live wire humming in the air. Rebecca moved closer, lowering herself to Tyler's level. "How's the dinosaur?" she asked softly. The boy's wide eyes brightened just enough. "He's okay." "That's good," Rebecca smiled, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "You kept him safe. That's what soldiers do." His small fingers tightened on the toy. "My dad was a soldier," he whispered, almost like he wasn't supposed to say it. Before Rebecca could respond, Corinne's voice cut in, sharp and trembling. "Not now, Tyler." Rebecca's heart twisted. She knew that tone. She had heard it from her own mother too many times, a voice built from grief, from a love so deep it hardened into fear. Corinne wasn't cruel. She was just holding back the tide the only way she knew how. Jack caught Rebecca's eyes across the room. There was understanding there. He knew what it meant to carry silence, to shield a child from a truth that could both save and scar. When Chief Morgan entered, the air shifted. Authority stepped into the room, measured and deliberate. His gaze swept over everyone, weighing, calculating. Rebecca straightened unconsciously, her body tense. He questioned her, and she answered with the clarity of a nurse who had faced panic and chaos before. She explained what happened, how Tyler darted, how the truck came too fast, how instinct, not calculation, had moved her. "Anyone would have done the same," she said softly. Jack's voice rumbled low, almost like thunder. "No, they wouldn't." And for the first time since she dove, Rebecca felt the tremor in her own hands. He had seen it. He had named it. The courage, the recklessness, the cost. She pressed her palms together to hide the shaking. But it wasn't over. It never was. The questions from police bent toward blame, toward negligence. Corinne's shoulders stiffened. Her voice rose, defensive. Rebecca could feel the woman's terror, the unspoken fear that saving her son might still cost her everything. That was when Iron Mike walked in. The lawyer moved like a soldier in a suit, steady, unyielding, commanding space without raising his voice. He took control with quiet precision, cutting through the police rhetoric with the same ease Rebecca had once seen surgeons slice through chaos on an operating table. He was there for Corinne, for Tyler, and strangely, though she hadn't asked for it, for her too. Rebecca stayed close to the boy. She leaned down, whispering little things to him that no one else could hear, about how strong he was, about how brave, about how sometimes accidents happen and it doesn't mean anyone failed. It means life is unpredictable, but you keep going. She could feel Jack watching her, reading more in her words than she said aloud. He saw the echoes, how she wasn't only speaking to Tyler but to herself, to the girl who once sat in a similar waiting room, clutching hope that never came. And outside the sound grew louder. The rumble of engines, a gathering storm. The Steel Brotherhood was arriving. Not a gang, not thugs, but men bound by service, by scars, by promises whispered over coffins draped in flags. They weren't here for intimidation. They were here for remembrance, for Steve Thompson, for his boy, for an oath made years ago in the shadow of loss. Rebecca walked to the window. Her breath caught at the sight of dozens of motorcycles forming a wall of chrome and loyalty outside the station. She felt the thrum of their engines in her chest, steady, relentless, like a heartbeat amplified through steel. Corinne noticed too. Fear and anger flickered in her face, but so did something else, reluctant recognition. The past had come calling, and it wore leather and patches and memories she couldn't keep out forever. Rebecca turned back to her. Her voice was soft but certain. You don't have to trust them, not yet, but maybe let your son see what his father meant to them. Sometimes legacy isn't danger, sometimes it's protection. Corinne's eyes filled, caught between resistance and surrender. Rebecca didn't press. She just sat back beside Tyler, close enough that he could lean against her if he wanted. Jack's shadow loomed near, steady and unshakable. Their eyes met again. For the first time, Rebecca saw something in him that unsettled her, a man prepared to carry not just his own weight, but everyone else's too. And deep down she knew, the storm was only beginning. The engines outside roared, and inside the small station, Rebecca whispered a quiet truth to herself, the kind of truth her father might have said if he were still alive. Sometimes survival isn't the victory. Sometimes it's what you do after. What happens when a woman who has always lived in the shadows is suddenly pulled into the center of a storm? That was the question circling Rebecca's mind as the steel doors of the Eaglewood police station closed behind her. The night air was heavy with the smell of oil, asphalt, and exhaust. Outside, the Brotherhood waited. Engines idled low, a steady heartbeat that filled the desert silence with a warning. We are here. Rebecca hesitated on the station steps. The glow of dozens of headlamps cast long shadows, painting the asphalt in lines of silver and fire. Men stood beside their bikes, shoulders squared, eyes watchful. They were older than she expected, weathered faces, scarred hands, movements too disciplined to be mistaken for anything but military. These weren't caricatures of bikers from television. These were soldiers who had traded rifles for chrome, still bound by codes the world had forgotten. And Tyler saw them. That was what struck her most. His small face pressed to the police car's window as his mother was led inside, his eyes wide, not with fear this time, but wonder. Rebecca recognized that look. It was the same one she had worn as a girl when strangers in uniform came to her door to deliver news her heart already knew. The kind of look children wear when they are trying to understand what bravery means. Jack Harrison noticed it too. He stood in the lot, speaking with two men who carried themselves like senior officers, but his gaze never strayed far from Tyler. He caught Rebecca's eye across the distance, and for a moment they were bound by the same realization. This boy was teetering on the edge of legacy and loss. Which way he fell depended on what happened next. Inside, the interrogation room was sterile, its cinderblock walls painted a tired gray. Corinne sat stiff-backed in the chair, her arms wrapped around her son like she was bracing for someone to tear him away. Rebecca stayed close, refusing to be pushed aside by uniformed men who spoke of protocol as if it were holy scripture. The questions came sharp, rehearsed, designed to pin responsibility like a badge of shame. Why was Tyler not holding her hand? Why was he allowed to run? Why was she not faster? Rebecca felt the tremor in Corinne's breathing, the silent collapse of a woman who had spent years fighting grief only to be accused of negligence for loving her son imperfectly, humanly. Rebecca leaned forward, her voice cutting through the cold air. I was there. She was right beside him. No parent can predict a child's every move. This was an accident, nothing more. Her words landed with the authority of someone who had pulled bleeding men from wreckage, who had seen real negligence, real failures. Chief Morgan studied her in silence. Something flickered in his eyes. He was caught, she realized, caught between duty and conscience, orders and truth. Later, when Corinne was finally released with her boy, Rebecca walked her to the door. The night outside was alive with engines. The sound rose and fell like the tide, a chorus of loyalty. Corinne froze at the sight. The weight of memory pressed hard on her shoulders. They promised Steve, Jack said quietly, stepping forward. His voice was gravel, rough with years and loss. They promised they'd look out for his family. Corinne's jaw tightened. I never asked for their protection, I asked for distance. Rebecca felt the ache in those words. She also saw Tyler's eyes, wide, searching, full of questions his mother wasn't ready to answer. She crouched beside him, lowering her voice so only he could hear. Do you know what makes someone a soldier? He shook his head. It isn't the uniform, she whispered. It's choosing to step forward when no one else will. Your father did that, today you saw it. And one day, maybe you will too. The boy clutched his dinosaur tighter, nodding with the quiet seriousness of a child who understood more than his mother wanted. Rebecca stood, her shoulder throbbing from the dive, her palms raw but her heart steady. She had been dragged into this fight by instinct, by the pull of her father's memory. Now she knew there was no stepping back. That night at the hospital, Rebecca stayed with Corinne and Tyler. She guided them through checkups, spoke with doctors, softened the edges of bureaucracy with the certainty of a nurse who knew how the system tried to swallow people whole. She brewed tea in Corinne's small kitchen, sat on the pull-out sofa, and listened to the silence between a mother and her boy, silence that begged for stories never told. Jack visited late, the Brotherhood keeping quiet watch outside. He stood in the doorway, large and solemn, eyes scanning the room as if it were a battlefield. Rebecca rose to meet him. You're planning something, she said. It wasn't a question. Jack's mouth twitched into the ghost of a smile. Always. Promise me it won't cost them more than they've already lost. He studied her for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking deep. Finally, he nodded. That's why you're here. Rebecca lay awake long after the apartment grew quiet. The city hummed beyond the walls, motorcycles murmuring like sentinels in the night. She thought of her father, of the folded flag still tucked in her mother's drawer. She thought of Tyler's small hand gripping hers, the weight of a child's trust she had not earned but could not betray. And she thought of Jack, his eyes carved from stone, yet softened when they landed on the boy. There was more to him than brotherhood, more than the hardened mask. She sensed a man still paying debts no one had demanded, carrying promises carved into his soul. In the quiet, Rebecca made her own vow, not the kind spoken aloud in front of witnesses, but the kind that lived in the marrow. She would not let this boy grow up haunted as she had. She would not let corruption write his story in ink of fear and silence. She didn't know how yet, but she knew this. Some storms you don't wait out, some you walk straight into. And when dawn broke, The rumble of 200 engines would rise with the sun. What would a child remember? The sound of engines in the distance or the silence of a mother's fear? Rebecca asked herself that question as she stood at Corinne Thompson's kitchen window, watching headlights flicker against the night. The Steel Brotherhood had stationed themselves in quiet formation outside, a protective ring that looked to some like intimidation. But to Rebecca, who had seen men hold a line against incoming fire, it looked like something else entirely: vigilance. She rubbed her shoulder, the bruised muscle stiffening from the dive beneath the truck. The pain was sharp, but it grounded her. It reminded her she was alive, that the boy she had shielded was alive. And yet her body wasn't the only place the ache lived. When she finally lay down on Corinne's pull-out sofa, she thought sleep might come. Instead, her mind wandered backward to the day a Navy chaplain had stood on her family's porch. She had been 9, clutching a stuffed rabbit, watching her mother crumble as the words fell. Commander James Miller, action in the Gulf, the rest blurred. But Rebecca remembered the way silence filled their house after. The kind of silence that wasn't peace but absence. Her father had been called a hero, awarded medals, written into history in the kind of careful paragraphs used to soften death, but she had been left with questions medals couldn't answer. Why him? Why then? Why hadn't anyone been there to save him as she had saved Tyler today? That memory pressed into her chest as the night stretched long. She whispered a promise into the darkness: not this boy, not this time. By dawn, the desert was alive with thunder. Engines rolled in from every direction, chrome and leather converging at the edge of Eaglewood. Rebecca saw it when she joined Jack and Iron Mike outside the old drive-in lot. Rows upon rows of motorcycles, their riders standing tall, a sea of weathered faces that carried both age and defiance. Jack stood on a rise, coffee steaming in his hand, eyes scanning the formation like a commander before deployment. His presence anchored the chaos. He didn't raise his voice, but when he spoke, the sound carried. "They came for Steve," he said, his gaze cutting across the horizon. "And they came for his boy." Rebecca felt it in her bones, the weight of that loyalty. It wasn't about spectacle, it was about promise. Still, she knew how fragile the balance was. Hundreds of riders rolling into town could look like a war march to outsiders. To a prosecutor like Rowland's, it was ammunition. She stepped closer to Jack, her voice low. "What if the boy sees this as fear instead of protection?" Jack's jaw tightened. "Then we teach him what it really means." And that was the line, Rebecca realized. Fear or protection, intimidation or solidarity. The difference would be decided not by the roar of engines, but by the choices of the people who carried them. Later at the hospital, Rebecca stayed close as Tyler was checked again. She watched the boy's fascination when Doc Williams, the Brotherhood medic, told him stories about his father, about scraped knees on charity rides, about laughter and stubbornness. Corinne's eyes glistened, torn between shutting the stories down and letting her son finally glimpse the man she tried to keep hidden from him. Rebecca laid a gentle hand on Corinne's arm. "He deserves to know all of him, not just the parts that hurt." Corinne swallowed hard. "And if that legacy takes him away from me too?" Rebecca hesitated. She thought of her mother, who had kept her father's memory like a relic locked in a box, never spoken aloud, and she thought of the emptiness that silence had carved in her. "Then maybe," she whispered, "the best way to keep him close is to let him carry it with him instead of fighting it." Corinne looked away, her face etched with conflict. By mid-morning, Rebecca rode pillion again on Jack's Harley, this time heading not toward chaos, but into something that felt heavier: truth. They were going to meet Martha Jenkins, the elderly landlord refusing to sell her building, the same building where Corinne and Tyler lived. Rebecca didn't know why, but she felt the moment's weight in her chest. She leaned into the curve of the road, her body moving with Jack's. For a woman who had always walked cautiously, the surrender was startling. At Jenkins's modest home, Rebecca listened as Iron Mike explained the corruption in Rowland's development plan, how an accident was being weaponized to push a grieving mother out of her home. Martha's lined face hardened, her voice steady despite her age. "I've buried friends, neighbors, and my husband on this land. I won't bury justice for the sake of a resort." Rebecca felt a rush of respect. The old woman reminded her of her mother, not in grief but in grit, quiet, stubborn, unmovable. Afterward, as the Brotherhood strategized logistics, Rebecca lingered outside with Jack. The desert wind lifted her hair, carrying the faint echo of engines from the drive-in where hundreds of men still waited. "You think this will work?" she asked softly. Jack's gaze stayed on the horizon. "It's not about working, it's about standing. That's what Steve did, that's what we do now." Rebecca studied him, the man who seemed carved from duty, who carried debts no one could pay. She wondered if anyone ever asked him what it cost to always stand. "You carry everyone else," she said quietly, "but who carries you?" His eyes met hers, steady, unreadable. For a moment, the silence between them was louder than the roar of engines. Then he turned back toward the horizon, his answer spoken not in words, but in the weight of his stance. Rebecca understood. Some people don't ask to be carried. They become the ground others stand on. That night when she returned to Corinne's apartment, Tyler greeted her with a shy smile and handed her the dinosaur toy. "You saved him," he said solemnly, "so he can protect you now." Her throat tightened as she took it. The toy was small, plastic, almost laughable in its fragility. Yet in that moment, it felt like a metal heavier than any her father had been awarded. Rebecca set it carefully on the table beside her, her heart whispering the vow once more. Not this boy, not this time. And as the engines rumbled outside like a storm preparing to break, she felt herself changing, not from nurse to soldier, not from civilian to operative, but from someone shaped by loss into someone willing to fight so another child didn't grow up haunted by silence. The night stretched long, and with it, a truth sharpened in her chest. Sometimes the bravest thing wasn't the dive under the truck. Sometimes it was the choice to stay after, to keep standing when the storm threatened to wash everything away. What does it take to break a mother's silence? The kind of silence that builds walls between a boy and the truth of his father. Rebecca wondered this as she sat at Corinne Thompson's kitchen table the next morning, the smell of burnt toast lingering in the air. Tyler sat across from her, legs too short to touch the floor, his small hands cradling a cup of orange juice like it was precious. He was watching Rebecca, curious, cautious, as though she carried answers his mother refused to give. Corinne hovered nearby, tension radiating from her every move. She'd barely slept. Rebecca could see it in the sharp edges of her face, in the way her eyes flicked toward the window where two Brotherhood members still stood guard outside. "They don't have to be here," Corinne muttered, not looking at Rebecca. "It makes us a target." Rebecca folded her hands around her own cup, her voice soft. "Or it keeps you from being one." Corinne's jaw tightened. That's what they said when Steve rode with them: protection, brotherhood, and all it ever brought was a coffin draped in a flag. The words stung. Rebecca had no defense, not for Corinne's grief, not for a pain that had never healed. But she also knew what silence cost a child. She lived it. She leaned forward, lowering her voice so Tyler couldn't hear. "You can't protect him by erasing his father. I know, my mother tried. It left me with nothing but questions and a folded flag." Corinne's eyes snapped to her, startled. For a moment the two women just stared at each other, two daughters of war, one a widow, the other fatherless. No arguments, no rhetoric, just raw recognition. Before either could speak again, Jack filled the doorway. His presence shifted the air, steady, immovable. "It's time," he said simply. Time for the interview at the station. Time for Tyler to be questioned by men who saw politics instead of innocence. Rebecca's stomach knotted, but she rose without hesitation. She wasn't letting that boy face it alone. The ride into town was unlike anything Rebecca had ever experienced. 30 riders flanked the car that carried Corinne and Tyler, forming an honor guard 2 columns deep. Engines idled low, controlled, deliberate. No revving, no showmanship, just presence. On sidewalks, people stopped to watch, their faces a mix of awe and unease. Cameras flashed. Phones recorded. The story was already rewriting itself in real time. Rebecca rode behind Jack again, holding tighter this time. Not out of fear, but out of something harder to name. Trust, maybe. Or the strange steadiness that came from being part of something bigger than herself. At the station, reporters swarmed. Rebecca could feel the spin before the first question was asked. Words like endangerment and neglect hung in the air, shaping headlines before truth was even spoken. But when Karen stepped out of the car, flanked not by outlaws but by veterans who stood tall and silent, the tone shifted. Cameras turned. The story began to fracture. Inside, Chief Morgan greeted them with professional calm, though Rebecca saw the tension in his shoulders. He led them to the interview room where Dr. Alina Grant, a child psychologist, waited. Her presence steadied the atmosphere. Tyler sat in the chair, clutching his dinosaur, his legs swinging nervously. Rebecca stayed close, her presence quiet but unshakable. The questions came gently, framed for a child. What happened? What did you see? Why did you run? Tyler's voice was small but sure. He talked about his dinosaur, about how it fell, about how he just wanted to get it back. He never once blamed his mother. Rebecca's heart clenched when his voice faltered, when his eyes darted toward her as if seeking confirmation that he wasn't doing something wrong. She smiled, nodding once, and he kept going. When it was over, when Morgan closed his folder and Dr. Grant declared the boy resilient, Rebecca exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Tyler had spoken his truth, and for now, it was enough. But outside, the storm was still gathering. Cougar, one of the Brotherhood's intelligence men, met them with a tablet in hand. "Rollins is pushing the media hard," he said, showing them headlines already circulating online. "Negligent mother endangers child in school zone accident. Prosecutor promises justice in child safety case." Karen's face drained of color. "He's turning me into a villain." Rebecca touched her arm. "That's because he knows the truth doesn't serve him, but stories can be rewritten." Jack's eyes narrowed at the screen. "Then we rewrite them." By evening, the Brotherhood's counteroffensive was already in motion. Cougar compiled video footage of the rescue, Rebecca diving beneath the truck, shielding Tyler with her own body. Multiple angles, slowed frame by frame. The truth made undeniable. Rebecca watched the clips with a strange detachment, as if she were looking at someone else. The woman on the screen wasn't cautious or uncertain. She was decisive, fearless. She had become what her father once was, and the world was about to see it. That night, as the Brotherhood gathered at their clubhouse, Jack laid out the next steps: protect the family, pressure Rollins, expose the corruption. The men listened with the focus of soldiers receiving orders. No bravado, no bluster, just resolve. Rebecca stood at the edge of the room, feeling both out of place and exactly where she belonged. She wasn't one of them, not by blood or by patch. Yet she had been pulled into their fight, bound not by choice but by the dive that changed everything. When the meeting ended, Jack found her outside under the desert sky. The night was cool, the stars sharp. "You didn't have to stay this deep in it," he said quietly. Rebecca looked at him, her voice steady. "I know, but neither did you." His gaze lingered, steady as stone. Then he nodded once, as if acknowledging something unspoken. And in the silence that followed, Rebecca felt it, the line between past and present, between grief and purpose. She wasn't just her father's daughter anymore. She was becoming her own soldier, in a battle not of bullets but of truth. The engines roared in the distance, a promise waiting to be kept. What happens when truth collides with power, and power refuses to yield? That question hung over Rebecca as she stood in the hospital lobby the next morning, watching Karen fill out paperwork while Tyler colored dinosaurs on a clipboard. The boy's hand moved in confident strokes, green crayon pressed so hard the paper nearly tore. Rebecca wondered if that was how children carried stress, through lines that pressed too deep, colors that refused to stay inside boundaries. The elevator doors opened with a chime. Reporters spilled into the lobby, their voices already sharpened into questions that weren't questions at all. "Mrs. Thompson, do you have a response to the charges being considered? How do you explain letting your son run into the road?" The words sliced through the sterile air, each one more accusatory than the last. Corinne froze, wide-eyed, her hand tightening on Tyler's shoulder. The boy shrank into her side, crayons forgotten. Rebecca felt heat rise in her chest. Without thinking, she stepped between them and the cameras. Her voice was calm but carried an edge that silenced the noise. "She doesn't owe you answers. Not here. Not today." Flashes went off anyway. Reporters scribbled, their eyes gleaming like vultures catching the scent of blood. Then one of them, a younger man in a suit too sharp for this small-town hospital, lowered his phone and smiled a thin, knowing smile. "Miss Miller," he said, "hero nurse, the one who dove under the truck, care to comment on your unusual decision?" Rebecca met his gaze head-on. There was nothing unusual about it. A child was in danger. I moved. He leaned in, voice smooth, rehearsed. Or was it a stunt? Convenient timing, all these bikers suddenly appearing. Some say this was orchestrated to influence public opinion. The accusation landed like a slap. Rebecca's jaw tightened. She could almost hear her father's voice in her memory. "They'll twist what they don't understand. Hold steady. Don't let them own your truth." "I don't do stunts," she said, her tone like steel. "I do my job, I save lives. That's the only story here." Before the reporter could press further, Jack appeared at her side. His presence was enough to scatter most of them, though cameras still rolled. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, but his stare carried the weight of decades spent commanding men in places where silence meant survival. The crowd parted. "Come on," Jack said quietly, guiding Rebecca, Corinne, and Tyler through the gauntlet. "They're not here for answers, they're here for headlines." Outside, the roar of engines filled the air. Dozens of Brotherhood riders had positioned themselves like a human barricade, their bikes forming a line that separated the family from the flashing lenses. Tyler's eyes widened, not in fear this time, but in awe. He reached for Rebecca's hand as if anchoring himself in the storm. That night, the confrontation escalated. Rollins himself stepped into the spotlight, holding a press conference on the courthouse steps. Rebecca watched the broadcast on a flickering television in the Brotherhood clubhouse, surrounded by men who muttered curses under their breath. Rollins' voice was smooth, confident, dripping with practiced sincerity. "This tragedy reminds us all of the importance of child safety. No one is above accountability, not even grieving mothers. Our office will pursue this matter with the seriousness it deserves." Rebecca felt her stomach twist. He wasn't speaking as a protector of justice. He was performing, using Tyler's near death as a prop, Corinne's pain as a platform. When the conference ended, the clubhouse buzzed with anger. Hawk slammed a fist onto the table. Gunny muttered about politicians who had never bled for anything real. Jack stood silent, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the screen. Finally, Rebecca spoke. "He doesn't care about Tyler. He doesn't care about Corinne. This isn't about safety. It's about power." The room quieted. The men looked at her, not as an outsider anymore, but as someone who saw the battlefield as clearly as they did. Jack's gaze met hers. "Then we show him what power really looks like." The next day, Rebecca found herself in a place she never expected, in front of microphones. Cougar had arranged it, pushing back against Rollins' media spin. The footage of the rescue played behind her on a screen. Rebecca watched herself dive beneath the truck, every frame a reminder of how close death had come. When the cameras turned to her, she felt her pulse quicken. Public speaking wasn't her battlefield, but Tyler's wide eyes flashed in her memory, and suddenly the words came. I didn't weigh consequences. I saw a child about to die and I moved. That's all this is. A child alive, a mother grateful, and a community that should be focusing on healing, not blame. The room fell silent for a beat. Then questions erupted, but this time the tone was different. Not accusation, curiosity, respect, even admiration. Later, Corinne pulled her aside, tears brimming. "You didn't have to do that." Rebecca squeezed her hand. "Neither did you all these years. You carried the weight alone. It's time you didn't." That night when Rebecca returned to Corinne's apartment, Tyler was waiting at the door with his dinosaur clutched tight. "Mom says you're like a soldier," he whispered. "Like Dad." Her breath caught. She knelt, meeting his eyes. "I'm not like your dad, but I learned from someone like him. Someone who taught me you don't run when people need you." The boy nodded solemnly, as though she'd handed him a truth he could hold on to. And as Rebecca tucked him into bed, she realized something she hadn't dared admit even to herself. Saving Tyler had not only given him another chance at life, it had given her one too. The storm wasn't over. Rollins was still maneuvering. The media was still hungry, but Rebecca felt the shift inside her. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was choosing, standing. And for the first time since her father's death, she felt she wasn't carrying his ghost. She was walking beside it. What does it look like when loyalty becomes a wall, when 200 engines drown out fear itself? Rebecca asked herself that as she stood on the roof of the courthouse parking structure, the desert sun bleeding gold across the horizon. From up here, she could see them gathering. One by one at first, then by tens, then by lines so thick the road looked like it had been carved from chrome and thunder. The Steel Brotherhood had answered. Not 50, not 100, more than 200 riders, their patches flashing in the light, their formation so disciplined it looked like a military column rolling toward the heart of Eaglewood. Rebecca's chest tightened. The sight was awe-inspiring, terrifying, beautiful. The air shook with the sound, a living tide of engines that turned heads miles away. People lined sidewalks with phones raised, children perched on shoulders, shop doors flung wide as if the whole town had been pulled into the gravity of this moment. But inside the courthouse, Rollins was preparing his own theater. Rebecca could see the staging even before she stepped into the marbled hall. Cameras positioned, reporters briefed, sound bites rehearsed. This wasn't justice, it was spectacle. Corinne sat rigid in a wooden chair outside the chamber, Tyler pressed into her side. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the boy's shoulder. Rebecca sat beside them, her presence quiet but unwavering. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her hand resting lightly on Corinne's was enough to remind her she wasn't alone. Then the sound hit. Engines, low and steady, growing louder, vibrating through the courthouse floor itself. The windows trembled. Dust sifted from the rafters. And suddenly every camera turned, not toward Rollins, but toward the doors. When they opened, the sight was almost biblical. Rows of riders standing shoulder to shoulder, their boots echoing on marble, their vests heavy with patches that told stories of wars fought on foreign soil. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They simply filled the space with presence, a reminder that some promises don't die with the men who made them. Rebecca's breath caught. She wasn't looking at bikers. She was looking at veterans who had traded uniforms for leather but never stopped carrying the weight of service. And she realized in that moment what Tyler was seeing too, his father's ghost, multiplied 200 times over. Rollins tried to reclaim control, his voice rising above the rumble. "This display will not intimidate the pursuit of justice." But his words were drowned out, not by engines but by silence. The Brotherhood stopped moving, their discipline absolute, their stillness louder than any speech. The room froze in that tension, power shifting without a single word spoken. Rebecca leaned close to Corinne, whispering so only she could hear. "He wanted to turn this into a trial of blame, but now it's a story of loyalty. Your son is not alone." Corinne's eyes brimmed, her grip on Tyler loosening just enough for him to step forward, curiosity outweighing fear. He looked up at the rows of men, his small hand tightening on the dinosaur in his pocket. And in that moment, the boy stood taller. Jack moved through the crowd like a commander among troops, his presence both anchor and storm. He didn't approach Rollins. He didn't need to. His very silence said enough. We are watching. We will not let you bury this family in politics. Rebecca felt her own heart shift. For years she had carried her father's absence as a wound, an open space that defined her. But watching Tyler see his father reflected in the Brotherhood, watching him step into a story larger than his grief, she felt something different. Hope. That night the Brotherhood rode in procession through Eaglewood. 200 strong, their engines rolling like thunder across the desert. Rebecca rode again with Jack, the wind tearing at her face, the horizon burning with twilight. She thought of her father, of the folded flag that had once felt like the end of everything. And she realized it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning she had been too young to understand. Tyler waved from Corinne's porch as the column passed, his small voice carrying faintly into the night. Dad's brothers. Rebecca swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. For the first time, she believed the boy might grow up not with silence, but with stories, stories that would shape him into something stronger than grief. And in that belief, she found her own redemption, not in saving a child under a truck, but in staying long enough to see what came after. Sometimes strength isn't in the dive. It's in the decision to stand when the storm arrives. And Rebecca Miller was standing now, not just as a nurse, not just as her father's daughter, but as someone who had finally stepped into her own kind of soldierhood. The engines roared into the night, and with them, the promise that this story was not ending here. What lingers after the thunder fades? That was the question echoing through Rebecca's mind as the desert night settled over Eaglewood, the last vibrations of 200 engines drifting like ghosts across the horizon. The town was quieter now. Not at peace. Peace was too fragile, too temporary, but steadier, as if the storm had passed without sweeping everything away. Inside the courthouse, Rollins faced a reckoning he hadn't expected. His press conference had been buried beneath headlines of brotherhood and loyalty. Footage of Rebecca's rescue flooded national broadcasts, the image of her body shielding Tyler beneath a truck, reframing the entire narrative. The prosecutor's polished words now looked hollow against the backdrop of raw, undeniable truth. Rebecca stood in the hallway, her bruised shoulder throbbing, her hands still trembling from adrenaline. She wasn't watching Roland squirm. She wasn't thinking about cameras. Her eyes were on Corinne and Tyler. Corinne was holding her son, but differently now. Not with the desperate grip of fear, but with arms that had loosened enough to let him breathe. Rebecca saw the change, small but real. The beginning of trust, of letting her son see more than grief. Jack appeared beside her, silent as always. He didn't need to speak for her to feel his presence. Together, they watched Corinne step into the press circle, not to defend, not to plead, but to speak. "My son is alive because of Rebecca Miller," Corinne said, her voice unshaking though her hands trembled. "She acted when no one else did, and I will not stand by while anyone turns that into a crime." The words weren't dramatic, they weren't polished, but they were honest, and in that honesty the tide shifted. Later, when the cameras were gone, when Rollins had retreated into his office to lick wounds that power couldn't heal, Rebecca walked with Corinne and Tyler into the cool night. The boy tugged on her sleeve, holding out his dinosaur again. "You should keep him," he whispered. "For luck." Rebecca knelt, her throat tight. She curled his small hand back around the toy. "No," she said softly. "He's yours. Someday you'll understand why." The boy looked puzzled, but he nodded solemnly, as if sensing the weight of her refusal. Back at the clubhouse, the Brotherhood gathered around a fire pit, their leather vests catching the glow of the flames. Laughter rumbled low, stories spilled like old whiskey, memories of Steve Thompson, tales of service, quiet acknowledgments of scars carried home. Rebecca sat among them, the only woman in the circle, yet not an outsider anymore. She didn't drink. She didn't tell stories of war she had never fought. But when one of the men asked her how she'd known to move so fast, she spoke of her father, of a Navy man who had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear decide. She spoke of growing up in silence, of the weight of a folded flag. And for the first time, she told it without breaking. The men listened, not with pity, with respect. Later, when the fire burned low, Jack walked her to her car. The desert night was vast, stars sharp against the black. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Rebecca turned to him. "You could have done this without me," she said. His eyes were steady, unreadable. Maybe, but it wouldn't have meant the same. She searched his face, trying to find the cracks beneath the stone. For once, she didn't need to. She understood him now. He carried everyone else because no one had ever offered to carry him, and she realized with quiet certainty that maybe she already was. When she finally drove home, the town asleep around her, Rebecca felt a calm she hadn't known in years. The storm had not erased her scars. It had not resurrected her father, but it had given her something else, something she hadn't expected. A chance to redefine what it meant to live with loss. She parked, sat in the silence of her car, and let the night settle. Then she whispered the words her father once told her, words she had carried all her life but never fully understood until now. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And for the first time, those words didn't feel like a command. They felt like her own. Rebecca Miller was not her father's shadow anymore. She was her own kind of soldier.